On December 31st, 192 AD, the Roman Emperor Commodus was murdered in his bath. He was 31 years old. By all accounts, he had it coming. Commodus believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, not for sport, but because he genuinely thought it proved his divinity. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles. September became Amazonius. October became Invictus. The city of Rome became Colonia Commodiana. The Roman Senate hated him. The people feared him. And when he finally died, the Senate didn't just celebrate. They tried to make it so he had never existed at all. They chiseled his name off of every inscription. They melted down his coins. They toppled his statues and smashing them into dust. They renamed the months back. They renamed Rome back. And then they passed an official decree. Damnatio Memoriae. Commodus was to be erased, not just killed, but unexisted. This wasn't revenge, it was something profound and more disturbing. The Romans understood we're only beginning to reckon with today, that controlling memory is the ultimate form of power. That existence itself is a privilege that can be revoked, that there are fates worse than death. This video is about how to erase a person from history, not as a how-to guide, but as an examination of one of humanity's most chilling capabilities. Because the Romans weren't the only ones who figured this out, and they won't be the last. To understand Damnatio Memoriae, we first need to understand what it actually was, because the term itself is somewhat misleading. The Romans never actually used this phrase. That's a modern invention, coined by scholars in the 19th century to describe a practice that didn't have a single official name in the ancient Rome. What the Romans did have was a collection of sanctions, punishments, and erasures that could be applied after someone's death. These were decided by the Senate, and they ranged from symbolic to absolutely totalitarian. The mildest version was simple. Don't build monuments to this person. Don't name things after them. Let them fade naturally into irrelevance. This happened to plenty of unremarkable emperors and officials. History forgets most people anyway, so this was less of a punishment and more of a formal acknowledgement. This person doesn't deserve to be remembered. But then there was this extreme version, the total erasure. This is what happened to Commodus. And it's what we typically mean when we talk about Damnatio Memoriae. It was systematic, methodical, and comprehensive. Every statue destroyed, every inscription chiseled away, every coin melted down, every mention of the person's name removed from official records. In some cases, even paintings and the mosaics were defaced. The goal wasn't just to stop people from honoring the condemned. The goal was to make it impossible for future generations to even know what they had existed. The process was labor-intensive. Rome was an empire built on inscriptions. Everywhere you looked, there were monuments, buildings, arts, columns, all covered in text commemorating someone or something. To erase a person meant sending workers across the entire empire to find every single mention of their name and to destroy it. This would take months, sometimes years, and it was expensive. But the Romans believed it was worth it. Here's what makes this particularly interesting. The Romans weren't trying to rewrite history. They knew people would still remember Commodus. The Senate remembered him. The people who lived through his reign remembered him. The whole point of Damnatio Memoriae wasn't to make living people forget. It was to control what future generations would know. It was an attack on historical memory itself. And it worked, sort of. We know about Commodus today because Roman historians wrote about him. Writers like Cassius Dio and Herodian documented his reign in detail. And those texts survived, but if we only had the physical evidence, the inscriptions and the statues and the icons, we would barely know Commodus existed. There would be a gap in the historical record, a missing emperor. The Senate very nearly succeeded in erasing him, but they didn't just target emperors. Damnatio Memoriae was also used against traitors, criminals, and political rivals. One of the most famous cases is Publius Septimius Geta, the younger son of Emperor Septimius Severus. Geta ruled jointly with his older brother for about a year. The two brothers hated each other. In 2011 AD, his brother arranged a meeting with Geta, supposedly to reconcile. Instead, he had his guards murder Geta in front of their mother. Then his brother declared that Geta had been a traitor, and then the Senate obliged him with Damnatio Memoriae. What followed was one of the most thorough erasures in Roman history. His brother ordered that Geta's name be removed from all inscriptions across the empire. Modern archaeologists have found hundreds of inscriptions where Geta's name has been carefully chiseled out, leaving blank spaces in text. In some cases, the erasure is so precise that you can still see the faint outlines of the original letters. His brother also executed thousands of Geta's supporters, anyone who might keep his memory alive. Ancient sources claim the death toll was around 20,000 people. Whether that number is accurate or not, the point still stands out. His brother didn't just want him dead, he wanted him obliterated. The Romans believed in the power of names. In Roman culture, your name was tied to your identity, your legacy, your very existence. To raise someone's name was to raise their soul. This wasn't just a political tool, it was a spiritual weapon. The Romans believed that the dead needed to be remembered in order to rest peacefully in the afterlife. If no one remembered you, if your name was destroyed, your spirit was condemned to wander restlessly forever. Damnatio Memoriae was eternal punishment. But here's the paradox. By trying so hard to raise these people, the Romans ensured they would be remembered. The act of erasure itself became part of the historical record. We know about Commodus and Geta precisely because the Romans tried to erase them. The blank spaces in the inscriptions, the destroyed statues, the missing coins, of all these absences tell a story. Silence can be louder than words. The Romans understood that memory is not neutral. It's constructed, it's maintained, and it can be destroyed. But they also discovered something more troubling, that perfect erasure is impossible. You can destroy the monuments, you can destroy the fact that the monuments once existed. You can remove the name, but you can't remove the evidence of removal. Erasure leaves traces, and those traces can be read. Still, the Romans came closer than anyone before them, and their methods would still be studied and refined, perfected by every authoritarian that followed. On June 14, 1918, a photograph was taken in Moscow. The photograph shows Vladimir Lenin giving a speech to a crowd. Standing on the platform next to Lenin are two men, Lev Kamenev and Leon Trotsky. Both were prominent Bolshevik leaders. Both were instrumental in the Russian Revolution.
and both would later be erased from this photograph. By 1940, official Soviet versions of this photograph show Lenin standing alone. Kamenev and Trotsky had been removed, completely, not just cropped out, but painted over, as if they had never been there at all. This was not an isolated incident. The Soviet Union turned photo manipulation into an industrial practice. As Stalin consolidated power throughout the 1920s and 1930s, he systematically eliminated his political rivals, and then he eliminated them from history. The process was methodical. After someone was declared an enemy of the state, their image would be removed from all official photographs. Sometimes this meant physically cutting them out of the picture. Other times it meant painting over them or airbrushing them into oblivion. The Soviet state employed entire times of photo retouchers whose jobs was to make people disappear. Libraries were purged, encyclopedias were reissued. With entries removed, history textbooks were written, and citizens were expected to destroy their own personal copies of photographs featuring the condemned. David King, a British graphic designer and historian, spent decades collecting original Soviet photographs and comparing them to their altered versions. His book, The Commissar Vanishes, documents hundreds of examples. In one photograph, 1926, seven Bolshevik leaders stand together. By 1940, only Stalin and two others remain. The other four have been erased. In another photograph, Stalin stands with Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. After Stalin had Yezhov executed in 1940, Yezhov was removed from the photograph. All that remains is Stalin standing alone on the riverbank. The photograph had been retouched so carefully that you would never know anyone else had been there. But it wasn't just photographs. The Soviets went further than the Romans ever did. They had the technology to do so. Film footage was re edited, speeches were redacted, archives were destroyed. And unlike the Romans, who mostly targeted the dead, Stalin erased people who were still alive, or rather, people who were about to be dead. Being removed from a photograph was often death sentence. It meant you were next one. This created a culture of terror that went beyond physical violence. Citizens learned to destroy their own evidence. If you had a photograph of yourself with someone who had been declared an enemy of the state, you burned it. If you had letters, you burned. If you had any connection to the erased person, you severed it publicly and emphatically. Because if you didn't, you might be the next one. Entire families were erased, not just killed, but removed from the record. Children were taken from their parents and given new names. In some cases, even the parents' existence was denied. Official records would show that the children had been orphans. The Soviet erasure wasn't just about controlling the past, it was about controlling the present and the future. By rewriting history, Stalin could legitimize his rule. He could present himself as the sole architect of the revolution. He could eliminate any competing narratives, and he could create a version of history where dissent had never existed, where opposition to Stalin was not just wrong but literally impossible. Because the historical record showed that everyone had always agreed with him. George Orwell understood this. In his novel 1984, the protagonist Winston Smith works for the Ministry of Truth, where his job is to alter historical records. Orwell wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." This wasn't fiction, this was Orwell describing what the Soviet Union was already doing. The novel was published in 1949, but Orwell had been thinking about Soviet erasure practices for years. He saw that Stalin had discovered something the Romans had not, that with modern technology, erasure could be nearly perfect. But even Stalin couldn't erase everything. Photographs survived, letters survived, memories survived. People who had fled the Soviet Union took documents with them. Historians in the West collected evidence, and eventually, after Stalin's death, some of the truth came out. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 acknowledged some of the Stalin's crimes, though not all of them. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in the 1991. Archives were open after that. The erased were restored, at least partially. We know about Trotsky and Kamenev and Yezhov because the erasure failed. But here's what should concern us. Stalin's erasure failed because the Soviet Union fell. The state that created the erasure ceased to exist. But what if it hadn't? What if the Soviet Union had continued for another century? What if the only records that survived were the ones that state approved? We like to think that the truth always comes out eventually. But that's not a law of nature, that's just hope. The truth comes out when someone fights to preserve it. And when the state controls all the tools of preservation, when it controls the archive and the photographs and the printing process, the truth can stay buried for a very long time. China understood this lesson. On June 4th, 1989, the Chinese government sent tanks into Tiananmen Square to disperse pro democracy protesters. The exact death toll is unknown. Estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. What followed was not just violence but erasure. The Chinese government immediately began scrubbing any mention of the massacre from official records. News reports were censored, photographs were confiscated, film footage was destroyed, and anyone who spoke about what happened risked arrest. But the erasure didn't stop there. The Chinese government realized something that the Soviets had not. That in the information age, erasure is not about destroying evidence, it's about making evidence impossible to find. The Soviet Union tried to eliminate the past. China simply buries it under an avalanche of noise. This is how internet censorship works in China. The Great Firewall doesn't just block content, it dilutes it. If you search for Tiananmen Square in China, you'll get results. Lots of results, but they'll all be about the square as a tourist destination. Historical facts about the architecture, information about visiting hours. You can scroll for pages and never find anything about the massacre. It's not that the information indeed doesn't exist, it's just that it's been rendered invisible by a flood of irrelevant content. Researchers who study Chinese censorship have found that the government doesn't need to block everything. They just need to make the truth harder to find than the lies. They need to create enough confusion that people give up searching. And it works. A 2019 study by researchers at Hong Kong University found that many young people in mainland China have never heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Not because they're stupid, but because the information has been systematically hidden from them. The erasure is nearly complete. But China has gone even further. They've started erasing people who are still alive. The most prominent example is probably Ai Weiwei. The artist and the dissident Ai Weiwei has been arrested, beaten, and surveilled by the Chinese government. This is a new form of damnatio memoria. It's not about chiseling the name of mountains, it's about removing them from the digital record. And unlike physical erasure, digital erasure can happen instantly. Stalin needed teams of photo retouchers working for months. China can erase someone with an algorithm in seconds. The Chinese government calls this maintaining social harmony. activist and Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo died in 2017 while under government custody. His death was barely mentioned in Chinese media. His name is blocked on social media. His writings are unavailable for most people in China. Liu Xiaobo might as well have never existed. He won a Nobel Prize and his own country raised him. But perhaps the most disturbing example is what's happening in Xinjiang. The Chinese government has detained over 1 million Uyghurs in what they call the re-education camps. The government denies this is happening. They say the camps don't exist. They've scrubbed satellite imagery, they've locked journalists, they've arrested anyone who speaks out. And they're not just from the record, but from existence. But here's what makes China's erasure different from Rome's or the Soviet Union's. China isn't trying to erase people from history, they're trying to erase them from the present. They're creating a reality where certain people and certain events don't exist while those people are still alive. And those events are still within living memory. They've discovered that if you control information tightly enough, you don't need to wait for people to die before you erase them. You can do it in real time. And the terrifying thing is that it's working. The Great Firewall is largely effective. Most people in China don't know what happened at Tiananmen Square. They don't know who Liu Xiaobo was. They don't know what's happening in Xinjiang. Not because they're not smart enough to figure it out, but because the information has been removed from their reality. And if information doesn't exist in your reality, does it exist at all? Now we need to talk about something uncomfortable because erasure isn't just about something authoritarian governments do. Democracies do it too, we just call it something else. In the United States, we call it getting cancelled. In the UK, they call it being no platform. In academic circles, it's called memory holding. The terminology varies, but the concept is the same. Removing someone from public discourse, from cultural memory, from the record. And before anyone gets defensive, I'm not saying that cancel culture is equivalent to Stalin's purges or China's censorship. It's obviously not. No one in the US is being executed for their political views, but the mechanics of erasure are similar. And that should concern us. Here's what I mean. In 2020, a debate emerged about J.K. Rowling and her comments on transgender issues. I'm not here to adjudicate the debate. What interests me is what happened next. Major bookstores in some areas moved her books to less prominent locations. Some libraries did the same. Her name was removed from certain Harry Potter promotional materials. The studio behind the Harry Potter franchise began distancing itself from her. And there was a concerted effort, largely on social media, to act as if she no longer existed. People would talk about Harry Potter without mentioning her name. They would say things like, "The books were great, it's a shame about the author." As if she had disappeared. Again, this is not the same as being airbrushed out of a photograph. J.K. Rowling is still wealthy, still alive, still has a platform, but there was an attempt, however imperfect, to remove her from the cultural narrative of the thing she created to make Harry Potter exist without J.K. Rowling. This is a form of erasure and it raises a question. Can you erase someone from culture without erasing them from history? Or consider Confederate monuments in the United States. After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, hundreds of Confederate statues were removed from public spaces. Many people celebrated this as overdue. These monuments, they argued, on traitors and enslavers, and removing them was a moral necessity. Others argued that removing the monuments was erasing history. Both sides have a point. The monuments were erected, in many cases not immediately after the Civil War, but during the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights Movement. They were symbols of white supremacy, not neutral historical markers. Removing them was a political act, but so was erecting them in the first place. But here's the complication. Once a statue is removed, what happens to it? Some are placed in museums, some are melted down, some are destroyed entirely. And when they're destroyed, they're gone. Future generations won't be able to see them, won't be able to study them, won't be able to understand what they represented. The context is lost. This is exactly what the Romans did. They destroyed the Commodus' statues, and now we can only study the fragments. I'm not arguing that the statues should have stayed, I'm arguing that the removal is not neutral. It's a choice about what we want for our future generations to know. And sometimes we make the wrong choice. In the 1960s, many Soviet monuments to Stalin were destroyed. Decades later, historians wished they had been preserved, not to honor Stalin, but to study how authoritarian regimes use public monuments to shape memory. Once something is destroyed, you can't get it back. The point here is that erasure is not always evil. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's justified, but it's never neutral. And we are making a decision about what future generations will know. We are controlling memory, and that's a form of power that should make us uncomfortable, even when we think we're using it correctly. Because here is the problem: the tools of erasure are neutral, they can be used by anyone for any purpose. The same technology that allows us to remove Confederate monuments can be used to remove monuments to civil rights leaders. The same social mechanisms that allows us to cancel J.K. Rowling can be used to cancel whoever the mob decides to target next. The same algorithms that China uses to censor information about Tiananmen Square could be used by any government to censor any information. The difference is not in the tool, it's in who controls it. And that's what's making modern erasure so dangerous. The Romans could chisel names of monuments, but it took time, effort, and resources. Stalin could airbrush photos, but it required skilled labor and centralized control. China can censor the internet, but requires a massive surveillance apparatus. But what happens when erasure becomes easy? What happens when anyone can do it? We're already seeing this. Social media platforms can ban users instantly. Search engines can delist websites, hosting providers can shut down entire platforms. And once someone is removed from the digital infrastructure, they effectively cease to exist online. They're not dead, but they're invisible. They're ghosts. And unlike physical erasure, digital erasure doesn't leave traces. There's no blank space on an inscription. There's no airbrushing mark on a photograph. There's just nothing. The person was never there. This should terrify us because if erasure becomes frictionless, it becomes easy, then it becomes routine. And then we stop thinking about it. We stop asking whether it's justified. We just do it, and once that happens, we've lost something important. We've lost the ability to disagree about what history should remember.